Welcome to this explainer. We usually just think of travel as, well, geographical movement, right? Just a way to see new places. But what if I told you it's actually this incredibly profound psychological mechanism? Today, we're going to unpack exactly how dropping ourselves into new environments literally reshapes our identity. We'll look at how it broadens our perspectives and permanently shifts our whole understanding of what feels familiar, important, or even possible. There's this fantastic idea that travel can feel like moving through space, but the real change happens in how space moves through you. That is absolutely the core premise of our journey today. We're not just talking about collecting passport stamps, getting lost in the Tokyo subway, or, taking amazing photos in a bustling Marrakesh market. We're talking about a fundamental internal shift. It's an introspective journey where your very own mind begins to look at you differently. Okay, let's dive into this first section, the internal map. Before we even pack our bags, we really need to understand what we actually mean when we talk about who we are, our baseline identity. When we hear the word identity, we usually think of these grand, sweeping beliefs or super fixed personality traits. But in reality, a huge chunk of our identity is just built from the quiet, day-to-day repetition of normal life. Think about it. What feels respectful to you? What feels fast? What feels safe or successful? Or even something as simple as, how close do you stand to someone when you're talking to them? These little cues and habits become so familiar over time that they just feel entirely natural, rather than something we actually learned. It's like having an internal map. Most days at home, that map just works quietly in the background, guiding you on autopilot without you ever really noticing it. Think about wearing shoes every single day. After a while, you completely stop noticing the shape of the shoe, right? It just becomes part of how you move. Well, in that exact same way, your culture, your routines, and your surroundings shape what you consider obvious. Travel essentially takes those shoes off for a minute, and suddenly, bam, you can feel the floor. You're dropped into a place where your usual instincts just don't fit perfectly anymore, and you are literally forced to notice all those little things you used to take entirely for granted. Which brings us to our next point, disruption and discomfort. Because as you can probably imagine, or honestly, as you've likely experienced yourself, taking off those familiar cultural shoes and feeling the bare floor isn't always a super fun, joyful experience right out of the gate. So why does travel sometimes feel so unsettling? Have you ever felt that initial wave of culture shock? Maybe you didn't know the right custom, or you accidentally tipped the wrong person, or you just couldn't quite catch the social rhythm of a new city, and you ended up feeling clumsy or exposed. We've all been there. It happens because your brain absolutely loves prediction. It wants the next moment to be familiar enough so it can handle it quickly and efficiently. When travel removes that easy predictability, your mind is basically forced to slam on the brakes and slow down. Here's the absolutely crucial point, though. This discomfort in travel, it's not a failure on your part, not at all. It is actually incredibly valuable information. It's an alert telling you that your automatic settings are no longer enough to navigate where you are. Think of it like a thermostat in a room that suddenly gets a lot colder. The system notices the drop and kicks in to respond. Travel introduces a totally new temperature into your mental life, and your identity has to start adjusting. Once those automatic settings fail, you're faced with a choice. You can either withdraw and protect your old worldview, or you can stay open just long enough to revise it. When the background disappears, the foreground becomes visible. This disruption is exactly the thing that forces us to notice our own defaults. Suddenly, you start noticing what makes you anxious, what sparks your curiosity, or what you genuinely need just to feel at ease. It's kind of like stepping into a familiar room, but with totally different lighting. The objects were always sitting right there, but under this new light, you spot entirely new details about yourself. Travel flips the lighting on your deepest assumptions. Moving on to how experience rewires identity. We know the disruption happens, sure, but how exactly does a single trip begin to literally rewire our sense of self? Perspective doesn't just magically shift because you see something new once. It actually happens continuously through three main channels: attention, interpretation, and repetition. First up, attention. This is where you might notice a culture that speaks way more bluntly than folks do back home. Next is interpretation. At first, you might label that directness as rude, but over time you start to reinterpret it as, say, refreshing honesty. And finally, repetition. You'll live through these blunt exchanges over and over again. Eventually, you aren't just observing this different style, you're actively absorbing it into how you operate. But how do we speed up that process? Well, emotion is the highlighter pen of memory. Not every experience leaves the same kind of mark, but emotionally charged ones, they sink in deep. Whether it's a super positive emotion like being struck by awe or discovering absolute beauty, or a tricky one like feeling deeply embarrassed or totally homesick, emotion acts as that highlighter pen. It literally tells the brain, hey, pay attention, this matters. It marks those new rules and files them deeply into your core sense of self. All of this creates a really powerful core loop. Step 1, the normal is disrupted. Step 2, that disruption forces your mind to compare the new reality with your old expectations. Step 3, you form a new interpretation of how the world works. Step 4 is repetition, giving that new interpretation real weight. And finally, step 5, your internal story officially updates. It's a lot like looking through a fogged-up window. You don't just suddenly see everything perfectly clear all at once. First, one shape appears, then another, until little by little the entire room becomes legible. Now let's talk about your expansive identity suitcase. As that fog clears, we enter this really cool phase of synthesis. This is where we look at how these repeated, newly interpreted experiences actually get packed up and brought right into our everyday lives. Imagine you carry around this sort of invisible suitcase of self-understanding. Back home, you only pack the tools you need for familiar, everyday settings. But travel completely changes the luggage check. Suddenly, totally different traits start to matter. You might find yourself packing patience instead of speed, humility instead of certainty, observation instead of assumption, or flexibility instead of your usual routine. Now, at first you probably think these are just temporary tools you need for the trip, but if you rely on them enough, they stop feeling temporary. They get permanently folded into your suitcase. What started off as just situational adaptation literally turns into self-description. And at the center of all this is one of the absolute deepest shifts travel provides, moving from rigid certainty over to flexible understanding. Picture a tree caught in a really strong wind. A rigid, stiff branch is just going to snap, right? But a flexible branch bends, adapts, and then returns. Travel makes your mind so much more like that flexible branch. It doesn't make you weaker, it makes you far more adaptive. It helps you stop confusing simple familiarity with absolute truth. You finally start to realize that a whole lot of your everyday habits and common sense judgments are just local, not universal. So, carrying the change home. This brings us to the real resolution of our journey today. What happens when the physical vacation is actually over? How does this psychological shift stick around once you've returned to all your familiar everyday surroundings? Well, everyone has an internal story. Maybe before traveling, someone's internal story was, I'm just not the kind of person who can adapt. I panic if my favorite coffee shop is closed. But after repeatedly figuring out the rhythm of a totally new place, like adapting to a 10 p.m. dinner time in Spain or stumbling through asking for help in a new language, that old story starts to weaken. It shifts to, okay, I can adapt when I need to. And eventually, the mind extracts a brand new meaning from all that hard evidence, finally settling on, wow, maybe adaptability is actually part of who I am. This is not just who I am, this is who I have been so far. This realization leads to a massive expansion of identity. You see, a narrower identity says, this is just who I am, which basically frames any new or unfamiliar situation as a threat. But a more expansive identity, one that's been shaped by the disruption and the learning of travel, says, this is who I have been so far. And you guys, that difference is huge. It means you start treating new situations not as threats to defend against, but as raw material for even more growth. So when you come home, you don't just leave all this profound learning behind at customs. You bring back a completely different scale for what feels normal, and a much larger set of reference points. Your living room, your neighborhood, your daily commute. Home looks exactly the same, but it no longer feels identical from the inside. Those old habits are definitely still there, but now they are visible to you as habits. You've finally seen that your version of normal is really only one version among many. Travel isn't magic. It is a profound system of change. It's about being seen differently by your own mind and knowing that the self isn't just one solid, unchangeable block, but a fluid pattern of responses shaped by place and expectation. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder today. Where will your internal map take you next? And who will you be when you arrive? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it's shifted your perspective just a little bit today, and I absolutely can't wait to explore more fascinating concepts with you next time.